Hello and welcome to this edition of Politics Today, and in today's programme we'll be discussing climate change as the government is hosting COP26, and this is the UN conference on climate change, and we'll be asking in this programme, is the government turning climate change into a cult? So to join me on this week's programme, I'm joined by Melanie Simmons, who is the editor of Heart newspaper, together with the Reverend Mark Whedon. So guys, welcome to the programme. Yeah. I'll start off with you, Melanie. Before we get into this big topic of climate change, what is the science, what is a biblical perspective to the response that our government, our media are calling the emergency crisis, climate crisis, or the forthcoming apocalypse that's only years away if we don't act now. Give us a taster of what's in the next edition of Heart newspaper, because you've got the front page, haven't you?
Oh, thank you very much, Simon. Yes, well, can I just say the current edition is still available, the current issue, and thank you for all the new people who've signed up. And at the end of November, the next issue will come out, and I believe this is the headline the Lord has given me, and this is very strategic. We've had this mocked up specially for this programme to show your viewers and to really, in a way, ask people to be praying, because it's based on a little book which Reverend Linda Rose has written called Missing Millions. Absolutely brilliant title, and it's the subhead is How Abortion is Harming Us All, and we actually strongly feel that it is such a stain on our nation because the Lord hates the shedding of innocent blood, and we would love to see nationwide acts of repentance, and we're going to try and suggest services that churches can hold, and to welcome Christians in general who may not have had abortions, men, women, but also members of the public who may now be regretting their decision and who need to know God's forgiveness.
Absolutely, that's very, very important, not only for this nation, but it's also so important for the unborn to speak up on their behalf. Great to see you, Mark. What do you make of this media frenzy surrounding the government's COP26 being held in Glasgow for the UN's climate change conference, and the fact that our media are calling this the emergency climate crisis, that it's the countdown to the apocalypse? Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, has already said it's 1 minute to midnight if we don't react. Our world leaders are presenting the arguments that if we don't change our carbon footprints and reduce carbon emissions drastically, then we face an apocalypse. What's your viewpoint on the way that the government's handling this, and how only 3 weeks ago or more there was no such thing as a climate emergency, but there is now?
Well, it does seem to be a media frenzy, Simon, because it's been talked up and talked up. If they really believed these things that they say is the situation, and that they're only 2 years ago it was warned that we had 12 years from America, and now there are 10 years left. But looking at the carbon footprint, we see 25,000 people descending on Glasgow for this conference. Why couldn't they have had, say, maybe 2,500 or even less? Why couldn't they have had a virtual meeting if they really believed that it's the carbon footprint that's the real problem? And we see motorcades of 26 vehicles, and albeit we know a president needs security, he'll need a few vehicles. It was 85 vehicles motorcade when he was in Rome just before, and then all the private jets that are appearing. You know, even the BBC has said that the top 1% produce a carbon footprint that is 30 times the rest of us. So yes, it's being whipped up, and I don't think they really believe it themselves.
So the big question we have to ask ourselves, Melanie, is that we are, as I said to Mark earlier, the media are portraying this climate crisis as an emergency crisis. Everything is couched in kind of apocalyptic terms. The United Nations had a report that was leaked only in the summer that was a 4,000 page long, that really said that we face a kind of apocalyptic scenarios in the coming decade, with millions and millions of people dying of hunger, of famine, that cities and countries will be destroyed underwater if we don't actually stop the reduce in temperature by 1.5%. So, not being a scientist, I think when we see such big statements and slogans on our media, we have to respond and give a biblical account, don't we, of what's going on. So, what is your assessment of COP26 and these proposals that the government and the international community are wanting to force on us?
Yes. I was reminded when you said about Boris says 1 minute to midnight that 2 or 3 decades ago, when the late Derek Prince was alive, he was saying that we are 5 minutes to midnight, and he was talking about the biblical time clock and Israel being back in her land. So there's an element of truth in this, but they're just focusing on the wrong thing. They're trying to please what Prince Charles calls nature herself. And apparently there's an exhibition with the goddess Gaia in one of our cathedrals, which will be put in the next paper, rather than looking to God himself. And it says, and Mark will be better than me on this, very clearly in the book of Revelation, that there will be these disasters. But of course, most of the world will be attributing it to the wrong source and thinking they can solve it themselves.
Oh, absolutely. Mark, I suppose the other aspect to bring into this one, because you do have a scientific background, and when you actually speak to Christian scientists in particular, they say there is no direct correlation between man-made CO2 emissions and the climate and the world warming up. And they say it's more to do with the kind of more the solar rays coming on the planet that's actually warming the planet up. And then, of course, they also talk about how the Earth goes through different environmental climate changes, in a sense. Sometimes the Earth will go cooler, then it will go warmer. But why do you think that the governments around the world, particularly in the West, are putting the fear of God in us, essentially, to change and adapt our way of lifestyle so that we can fit in with this new, which I can only describe as a new green religion?
Well, it's a very useful tool, isn't it, to achieve political ends, whether there be control or taxation. And one can see the taxation is looming very clearly on us for carbon taxes, and we've already got it for flying. But the Earth was warmer than it is today in the 1400s. And here in the UK, when the Romans were here in the 1st century, they grew vines up at Hadrian's Wall. So clearly it was warmer then as well. We go through cycles, and many scientists know this. And also, when you think of carbon dioxide, there's the oxygen-carbon dioxide cycle. And the more carbon dioxide that goes into the atmosphere, the more the plants suck it up and grow more. And so this is God's world, and he put systems in place to sustain this world. He's the sustainer of it. So yes, it's alarmism, I think, for political ends.
Yeah. And Melanie, we know that we will have a duty given in the book of Genesis to actually manage the planet, to stop the pollution of our rivers, and to stop, for example, littering and other things that do the planet harm. For example, also the pestilence that are used on farms by farmers, and the cutting down of hedgerows that's so needed this time of year, particularly for birds as we head into the winter. So we all have a responsibility when it comes to the climate. So we're not saying that we don't, but I suppose one thing I want to raise on this program is the alarmist and the rhetoric that our politicians are using, our media is using. And isn't this another kind of fear-mongering on behalf of the governments in the world to get us to change our lifestyle by going vegan, to stop us flying, to reduce our consumption of meat, to change our cars, to fit what is increasingly becoming almost like a religion?
Yes, I agree completely. However, the Lord actually made allowance for nature to repair herself by setting up the Shemitah year. Every 7 years, the land was supposed to lie fallow. Now, we haven't done that. And of course, when the Lord allowed the Babylonians to, the Chaldeans to take the Jews away from their land, it was, they hadn't been doing this, and they'd been worshipping other gods, and they hadn't been following his laws. And the land had a rest for 70 years, for that right number of time for the land to repair herself. So we ignore that. I completely agree that I don't want to see microplastics ending up in little babies or in little baby dolphins or whales, whatever, any of that. So I'm careful of the plastic. But in terms of the whole fossil fuel picture, it is being wildly exaggerated. It's probably based on fairly dodgy science. There's been a book just written which will not get into the mainstream, and it's called Climate, All Is Well, All Will Be Well, and it's published by the Bruges Group, and I've got a little article on it which is going in the IX paper. He says the greatest miracle is that nature, by its laws of physics, ensures that there is no runaway warming, for when CO2 density exceeds 290 parts per million, it can no longer absorb radiation. Present density is 417 parts per million. CO2 levels are lower than the last, well, he gives a rather large amount, 500 million years, which we don't believe in. But he says doubling CO2 will have no adverse climate consequences. That's why there's never been runaway global warming, even when CO2 was 8 times today's level. So there's a science here which simply isn't being discussed. And that's what really concerns me, because it is man-made climate change has become a cult, but more than a cult, it's become mainstream. For instance, I know, because I was a teacher, that it's actually being taught to school children. It's in their geography books. It's not being presented as something to discuss. You know, does man's activities have a responsibility for warming the climate? It's discussed. They're just told it as a fact. So it's out there already. Like evolution, it's something which children are being taught, and that's why some Christian parents take the children out of school.
Yeah, and Mark, it's very interesting that our own Prime Minister Boris Johnson back in 2015 was a climate skeptic, and now he's bought into this hook, line and sinker. Do you think that he's either been influenced by the globalists to push this agenda and going against his own political instincts, or is he completely under the spell of his wife, his new wife, Carrie Johnson, who we know is an adherer, almost a devoted follower of this new green religion?
I don't know so much about his wife, but I do suspect there is some influence that is coming there, and it's happened before with prime ministers in our country and in others, where the wife seems to have a very large influence on the agenda. But Boris is a similar sort of age to myself, and when I was at school, we were told that there was an ice age coming, and that's not that long ago, relatively, you know, when you're looking at this big picture. So how come things have changed so dramatically? I do notice that Bill Gates came into town recently, and ever since then, certain things have been highlighted in the media, and Boris has come out with his rhetoric very, very strongly. So yes, there do seem to be forces behind the scenes to give people the narrative that they are to spell out to other people.
Yeah, and Melanie, I think what alarmed me is when Dominic Cummings was removed from his position. Not that he's that likeable guy, but we know that he's been described as being Boris's brain. He was the architect of Brexit, and that we knew that if he was the main advisor to the Prime Minister, then in terms of Brexit, we would be safe and the Conservative Party would follow a conservative agenda. You know, the whole meaning of conservative means to actually conserve our institutions rather than bring about radical changes. But we've seen that Carrie Johnson was very much offended by him, and she wanted to get rid of him. So now he's gone. She's the main player with the main access to her husband pushing this climate agenda on the government. So how much do you think this is actually going away from traditional conservative values of conserving and pushing a very kind of liberal, extreme left viewpoint of the world for political purposes?
Yes, that's a very good point. I wouldn't necessarily call it extreme left, but it's certainly not traditional conservatism. I've been concerned about the direction of the Conservative Party ever since they changed their logo and they took on a kind of green tree. We thought they were the Green Party a few years ago. I thought, why? You know, but ironically, what we saw in the last election with the results was that people wanted something more traditional. They got all those red wall voters, including Tony Blair's old seat of Sedgwick, what was it, Sedgemoor? Sedgefield, sorry. And so these were voters who actually wanted Brexit because they wanted to retain a sense of nationhood. They weren't voting because they wanted to have to restrict their way of life and suddenly not have gas boilers, etc., etc. So there is a very big concern, because I remember that I think it was Sir Mark Sedwill said off the record that Dominic Cummings was the only brain in the building about number 10. And he had a brain, and he would have looked at stuff dispassionately and said, well, look, there's this other point of view, and or somehow, with his political astuteness, I think, helped shift the emphasis. The thing one feels with Boris is that somehow he sort of says what the last person said to him, I'd love to be wrong, but I don't know. And the concern is that there's a lack of proportion to it all, a lack of proportion, and they're trying to impose something, much like they did with the COVID measures, which doesn't have much evidence in science, has no link with tradition, and isn't being carefully thought through. The Chinese plan things years ahead. They didn't even bother to come to the summit, which has, Mike Pompeo said, you know, can either be because President Xi thinks he's not safe at home, or just because he holds it in some contempt. I suspect the latter. And they plan for decades ahead. We're not. We're in short-termism, and we're being committed to ridiculous expenditure figures, which will certainly probably never be fulfilled, and certainly after the term of this government.
Yeah. And Mark, one thing the government is suggesting is they're willing to subsidise new green efficient boilers. And these boilers cost £10,000 each, but the government is willing to give everyone a £5,000 grant, and they have to meet the other £5,000 themselves to actually insulate our homes properly. Now, when we see all of this and are reducing our dependency on fossil fuels and everything else, it's going to lead to massive energy shortages because we can't rely upon wind power, because apparently this summer there was hardly any wind, so it didn't generate enough wind power that was needed for electricity. So are we not in great danger now of becoming energy weak? We're in danger of having blackouts. At the same time, the Chinese and the Russians are continuing to use fossil fuel and continue to advance their kind of military preparation. And yet we are being taken back to the Stone Age with this green technology.
Well, first of all, Worldometers tells us there's 402 years worth of coal left, which is a very great deal, so there's no problem to worry about there. And there's about 150 odd years of gas left as well. And so in terms of those carbon issues, which obviously they will have a particular aspect about the burning them, we've got the resources. But when you look at the wind power, yes, they don't store the electricity properly. The same with solar power, doesn't store the electricity. And so California, which is a sunshine state all year round, they're having blackouts. And with the wind, I mean, those of us who believe the end times things in the book of Revelation, God says in chapter 7, verse 1, that the time will come when the winds will be stilled. They will be held back. There will be no wind. And so this move goes right against Scripture. And as believers, we understand that God created this world. He's in control of all of these things, and we need to see what he's really saying. So we are looking for shortage. We will be, getting shortages of energy. And strategically, when you mention China and Russia, there's a war going on, and they're far more skillful at this than we are. So I think there are real concerns that need to be looked at there, which you raise.
And Melanie, on this programme, it's also very important to look at the kind of spiritual aspect of this, that we draw our inspiration and our guidance from the Word of God. And the Word of God clearly states that there will be a new heaven and new earth made, because God promises that in Revelation. But we also have in the book of Revelation how the Messiah, Yeshua HaMashiach, is going to reign for Jerusalem for 1,000 years. So these emergency climate scientists are saying that we have less than 10 years to save the planet. But the reality is we know that our planet's going to go on for an extra 1,000 years within the millennial realm. So shouldn't this actually bring a lot of comfort to our viewers to get a biblical world viewpoint rather than a political or a news viewpoint when it comes to the planet Earth?
Well, yes, I hope they will and go back to their Bibles. What does concern me is when you hear prayer leaders, like I did within the last 3 years or so, saying that the climate was the top priority for Christians, not abortion, not murder or violence, nothing like that, but the climate. And I thought that was a little bit strange and concerned me very much. And I think Christians should have the biblical perspective. And I'd just like to say also they should have a concern for the developing world, because and look at things, step back and look at things, not just believe what they're told on the media. And the last 18 months have shown me anything, it's that lots of Christians are probably spending more time in front of their televisions than in the Bible, and I've seen that in their reactions, because they're having the sort of the man-made reactions and reacting like the rest of the population is, in fear or whatever. But because the Prime Minister wants to remove coal, it would cause an energy crisis in Africa. So the President of Nigeria has done a carefully rather good riposte, President Muhammadu Buhari, on Newsweek, and he decried the rush for electric cars, because he said that meant there would be a scramble for lithium batteries, and he said that scramble for lithium batteries, all the West coming over and sort of, crawling all over Africa to get their lithium and sending children down mines, etc., it'd be replaced last century's scramble for fossil fuels. So it's not thought through, and Christians should be concerned about what's going to happen to the third world, which has been a traditional Christian concern.
Absolutely. And Pastor Mark, it's very interesting, isn't it, that Greta Thunberg, the spokeswoman, I think she's only just turned 18, so we can call her a spokeswoman, is really the mouthpiece for so many young people when it comes to climate change. Now, she's pronounced the G26 COP summit as a complete flop. And also, I think she's actually described this one as being absolutely hypocritical. So we do see a case where by our world leaders, also the likes of the CEO of Amazon, Bezos, together with, sorry, I've forgotten the guy, Bill Gates, for example, and others, arriving in Glasgow on big yachts and ships. And you mentioned earlier something like 90 private jets flew into Glasgow for the climate change summit. Isn't there a huge element of hypocrisy going on from our leaders telling us all to go green when they themselves are not prepared to go green, and ultimately knowing that this will cost us, the taxpayer, more money to actually go green, and the government's putting that burden onto the electorate?
Well, I hope she's right that it is a big flop. And yes, there is a hypocrisy about all of this, because it's one law for us and another law for them. They just do whatever they please. And I think a lot of people are seeing through this. And it's how we sort of respond and argue against it, because it is us who pays, and it's not the Chinese or the Russians who are going to be paying. It's the Westerners. And I think we need to fight back carefully, wisely, but we do need to respond.
Yeah, and Melanie, don't we need to tackle this issue? And our media is obsessed with this at the moment. It's dominating our news agenda. It's on our chat shows. It's in our newspapers. It's in our advertisement. Everything's about going green. And don't you think there's a huge religious element to this? It's almost promoting the worship of the planet rather than the creator of the planet. And is this not another come out of a spiritual vacuum, because we've moved so far away from our Judeo-Christian heritage? We're looking to have our nations and our governments having to look at a new form of set of moral values and codes in which to follow. So how much would you say this green agenda is actually more based on a kind of religious fanaticism than it's actually based on the actual science itself?
Yes, completely. I completely agree about the concept of a religious vacuum. There is completely. So people will feel it was something else. They don't fear God, so they will fear sickness, or they will fear the climate changing. They don't have that focus. They're not getting up in the morning and think, Lord, how can I please you today? They're thinking, how can I do the right thing? Wearing my mask or recycling, whatever it is. I do have some time for recycling. But I wanted to say something else about two things which people are overlooking. The late, I think it was late, Christopher Booker, I found an article, I love saving old cuttings, from 2014.
Can you move in your house? with newspapers and cuttings?
Don't ask. So 2014, and the headline was, how did the IPCC's alarmism take everyone in for so long? And he says, when future generations come to look back on the alarm over global warming that seized the world towards the end of the 20th century, much will puzzle them as to how such a scare could have arisen. They will wonder why there was such a panic over a 0.4% increase in global temperatures between 1975 and 1998, when similar rises between 1860 and 1880 and 1910 and 1940 had given no cause for concern. But he also makes a very key point that with these huge reports, which you referred to at the start of the programme, from the IPCC, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they release a great big thick document and then they do a summary for policymakers. And he makes a point that if you actually look through the reports, they have very little bearing on the summary for policymakers. So the summary for policymakers is what gives the headlines. People skim that, oh good, there's a headline, we're doomed, right, we'll put that in. But he says that they don't bear much relation to the real reports. So clever people need to be looking at the actual documents and drawing it out. It probably won't get any publicity, but it's something that Christians should be aware of. And I'd just say one also point. Climate change or the environment has been seen as an excuse for bringing in a one world government. I'm sure that won't surprise most of your readers, but I found some evidence the other day. Sir Christopher Monckton, one of Mrs. Thatcher's advisors, commented on a previous jamboree for the environment, and he pointed out, and he said this on an American, I think to an American university a few years ago, that when he looked at the memorandum accompanying the invitations for the event, he said it was a pretext for a one world government. It was just an excuse.
Yeah, and Mark, we've got less than 2 minutes, and I think we could definitely do an extra half an hour on this programme, particularly when we consider that the World Economic Forum have produced their documentation, I think back in September of 2020, where they said that we don't want to miss the COVID-19 opportunity for a global reset. And now they put climate change as the big agenda that government's got to adhere to. So how, as Christians, and particularly being a pastor, should we respond to these news headlines of the coming emergency crisis and the emergency climate crisis that we're all told that we are actually facing?
If there were truly a climate crisis, then obviously, yes, we all live on the same planet, it's one world, and we would need a global response to a global problem. But that's assuming that it's true, and we're obviously questioning that very, very seriously from a scientific perspective as well as a Christian perspective. And so we should look at the headlines with skepticism. And we've touched on before that there is an age of deception that we're living in. Jesus warned of these things. And so we need to come back to the scriptures and see, what does God say? And if we look at, for example, Jeremiah or Amos, or we can even look at Job, and we see that God is in control of this world.
Mark, Melanie, thank you so much for being my guest on this week's Politics Today. And I want to thank you for watching this programme. I think the message coming from this programme today is that we have to be extremely vigilant. We have to be extremely careful of what we're told by our mainstream media and also our politicians. We need to kind of question the science, but we need to put our faith and our trust in God because the deception is coming. So thank you for watching this week's edition of Politics Today.